It's time for Class Racing Today, the podcast for the NHRA class racing fan. Welcome back to Class Racing Today, classracingtoday.com. Today, December 1, here in the CRT podcast studio, all the way from Millbank, South Dakota, and somewhere in New Jersey. Bobby and Brian are here with us. ClassRacingToday.com. If you go there today, we have a very basic new website that's up. So go to ClassRacingToday.com, and you get to see Brian and Bobby's cars sitting there doing some wheelies a little bit. But there is also the opportunity for you, as a listener to the show, to support the show directly. There's a donate option there. All your support is very appreciated and welcome. Any amount is awesome. If you get value out of the show, whatever that value is, turn that into a dollar amount and send it our way. And we appreciate it very much so we can keep doing these conversations around the drag racing world. Brian, what are we doing? How are you today?
Man, I have not been able to sleep because I wanted to try to mix it up a little bit. And I met today's guest about officially a year ago. And it's probably the single best thing I've done to learn how to race. So I'm like, you know what? How can we share this? How can we help everybody? Not you D5 people. It's okay if you shut it off right now because I don't want you getting any better. You're already killers. But I thought, you know what? How can I help Bobby win another national event? You know, he has a Ford, so he needs all the help he can get. And the guy we have coming on today is pretty cool. When he was at Brainerd, I just saw that car back and forth. And thank God he wasn't in stock eliminator that day. So, Bobby, are you excited?
I am thrilled. I haven't been this excited in a while because I love learning things, and I'm excited. I know I'm going to learn something today that I'm going to take with me, forever here with my driving, and I could always use a little help. Let's just say that. So let's welcome him. Let's waste no time here. Mr. Luke Bogacki, how you doing, sir?
Great. Thank you guys for having me on. I listened to the show a couple of times. I didn't realize until I got in here with you guys, like how professional an approach this is. This is night and day from the podcast that I'm used to. You guys are doing a great job with this. This is cool.
Thank you. I don't know. I think you have probably quite a few more listeners than we do. So we'll just merge the two ideas. And
I'm curious, before we get started, Brian, how did you guys get together from opposite ends of the country?
So I know virtually nothing about racing. I've just kind of started and thought, hey, let's jump into stock eliminator. And I used to listen to class racing podcast Chuck and Aaron did. And that's how I was like trying to just suck in information as much as I could. And all of a sudden it was gone and they weren't doing it. And I'm like, man, is somebody doing something? And I actually helped Craig build this studio 4 years ago. I'm like, what are we doing?
It's 2017.
He's like, oh, we're building a podcast studio. I'm like, what the hell's a podcast? Like, I don't know what it is. So we built this cool little room, and I don't know. I just like to ramble on and learn about new things. So I thought, hey, let's do one.
And then I randomly posted somewhere. I'm like, is there a podcast for stock at Super Stock? Somebody should do one. I didn't even know that other one existed with Aaron and Chuck. So I felt like a dummy saying that. And then Brian called me up and said, hey, I live in South Dakota. I have all the equipment. Let's do a podcast. And that's basically how it happened. We didn't even meet each other in person until like 6 months into the podcast.
Awesome. And here you are, 50 episodes later?
Almost.
Something like that.
Very cool.
And the biggest thing is, like, I just wanted to do, I wanted to try to do the best quality we can because, I just feel like I'm obviously probably not the most professional person, but you know what? I wanted it to sound right, look good, and just try to spread as much information as we can and try to grow, class racing and talk about it. And there's just not really an outlet, the Sportsman side gets a lot of love, and our little niche market we have, just everybody loves to talk about it. I mean, you go talk to any guy that has a class car and you can be tied up for hours on end. So just thought it was a good way to spread the message.
No, 100% agree. You guys are doing an awesome job, and I would love to see more of this type of show. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like, to your point, there's so many corners, so many niches within our sport that don't get the spotlight that they deserve. And you guys doing your part for stock and super stock, like, there should these are relatively easy things to do. You know, as a podcast host, I know that's a time suck and there's some energy that goes into it, but it's not cost prohibitive and it's not all that difficult to put together. Like people, I think there's a ton of opportunity here to shed that spotlight in so many areas that it's warranted. You guys are doing that.
There should actually be a disclaimer. You're starting a podcast. You just lost 75% of your life. Click here to accept this responsibility. Like, everybody thinks it's easy. Like, oh man, you just call each other and talk. Like, they don't see the other 15 hours of editing and.
That's like you win in a race, right? Somebody sees the 7 win lights. They're like, oh, there's nothing to that. They don't see the hundreds of hours that went into getting competitive. You know, yeah, podcasting's similar in that regard for sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying not to fanboy out because I do like to listen to your podcast. And like I said, anytime you can reach out and you can just pull something. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Some of the stuff I've learned just from listening to your podcast and the mental game and stuff, like it has some real life applications. I ended up on a crazy mission this weekend that in Vegas at a competition, nothing related to racing. And I'm like, all right, I need to hydrate. I'm going to go to bed. You know, you're in Vegas. Everybody's going to the strip. I'm like, no, it's 9:30. I'm going to my room. I need to be sharp. I want to make the right decisions. And I'm like, man, if Luke knew what I was doing and how I'm using his his approach right now, nobody would believe it. But
I would assume that the definition of hydration that many of your competitors were using at Vegas was slightly different than your own.
Yeah, like, and I don't drink anyways, so I'm hitting the water pretty hard. And I'm like, all right, we got to be sharp. I'm gonna try to bump it up an extra gallon today. And everybody else, one guy showed up at 4:00 in the morning, and he's literally paying $200 a run, and just a mess. And his results kind of proved it. I mean, it was just, you know, there's just little details that the pregame work just to pay for, you know, I always say it costs the same whether you suck or not. So why not just try to be the best, right?
Yeah, I like that approach for sure.
Well, let's we could banter all day long, but I'm just kind of curious. Tell how did you get started in drag racing? I mean, walk us through the Luke at a little boy age. Have you always been cool hand, or did that come on later in life?
The nickname actually came from a fellow competitor in Texas when I was growing up, and it just kind of stuck. I think because I leaned into it. My dad definitely leaned into it, but my dad is how I got started in racing, Brian. My father raced from the time before I was born, and actually his background was more in class racing. You know, go back to the modified production days and a little bit of super stock and stock back in the 60s and 70s. Dabbled in top alcohol funny car for a little while. By the time that I came along, he was more or less committed to bracket racing. I was born in Southern California, so bracket racing there at that time looked a little bit different than what we're used to today. Like it was 5/10 pro tree, staggered start. You know, that was the norm. Or that's my earliest memories of watching racing and watching him race. But yeah, I would imagine I am like some of those people that say, you know, like, yeah, my first trip to the track, I was like 2 weeks old. I don't know exactly when that was, but it was very early in life. And I just remember idolizing my father in a way that I think most children do. But a lot of that for me kind of built around racing and how much of a superhero he was to me, like to get in the car and go down the racetrack. And I just remember not only putting him on a pedestal, but having a reverence for the sport. And as I learned more about it, the game for as long as I can remember, you know, from a really young age. My dad used to always tell stories about walking around at swap meet with him, and I'm like 4 years old, and I my overalls and just walk up to some vendor and just serious as a heart attack, walk up, hey, how much you want for that blower? You know, like stuff like that. So I was that kid.
That's pretty awesome. What was your introduction? Like, what was your first trip down the track? Do you remember? Or
to actually driving?
Yep.
Yeah, so NHRA announced or implemented the junior dragster program. I want to say in '92 was when Vinny Knapp rolled that out in Englishtown. It hit our area or our local track. By that time, my parents had relocated to Texas, and that's probably the area that I would call home still to this day. It's we moved there when I was in third grade and lived there in the same home until I graduated college, and then I moved to Alabama and ultimately up to Illinois, where I live now. But our home track, Texas Raceway, implemented the junior program at the beginning of '93, and I had my dad was all over it, which I was obviously pressuring him pretty hard at that point. I was 11, and so I had one of the first cars in our area. And my first trip down the track, I was trying to remember the timeline of this, because now I can't really imagine just going out there and just being completely thrown to the wolves. But I don't remember like testing. Like, I think my first run down the track was the time trial at the first race that was ever contested at Texas Raceway, first junior dragster race. So there was 8 of us, all racers' kids, obviously, at that point. None of us had any idea what we were doing. But one of my favorite stories and like claim to fame was that I won that race. It was literally the first time that I ever raced. It was awful. And I try to tell my kid, my oldest son, Gary, has just started his junior career. And where we live now, he's racing against older kids with better cars. And he's at least initially kind of got his teeth kicked in. And I'm trying to convince him, like, you're doing great. Like his lights the first 2 weeks are better than anything that I had put together that opening night. I just happened to win because we were all such a blank page and starting from scratch. But yeah, that's my first time down the racetrack. So 1993, I think April of '93 at Texas Raceway in Kennerdale, Texas.
One thing that I had this conversation with my wife the other day, and my oldest wasn't all kinds of sports. I think I almost got him out of them now. I don't sport. My wife had to teach him how to throw and catch and all that stuff. But it's funny, like, kids don't really know how to lose. How many sports, like maybe wrestling, it's always somebody missed the catch, somebody didn't throw it right. You want to talk about that, like when you're in that junior car and that wind light doesn't come on. I mean, it just crushes you every time, and it kind of gives them that mental fortitude to keep going. And I think that's why some people just, it takes a lot of work to get better, and it takes a lot of practice, and like it takes a drive. And I just don't know if you get that with team sports like you do, when you're in a race car. If it doesn't come on, you did something,
Man, I had this conversation with a friend the other day, and racing with Gary, my oldest son, like I say, it brings back some memories, but it's so eye-opening just in terms of competition and responsibility and life skills. You know what I mean? The stuff that we kind of take for granted, I think. But what I was telling my buddy yesterday was part of my son and I's routine on the starting line. We go through the whole deal and get the idle set, your typical junior dragster stuff. And the last thing we do, I roll him up probably, within 4 or 5 inches of pre-stage and stop him. And the last thing I do is I point to him like, hey, it's on you. You know what I mean? And walk off. And if you could see the look in my 8-year-old's eyes when I say, dude, it's on you, right? Like, he just lights up. And what it made me realize is that I don't think of my wife and I as like helicopter parents necessarily, but like any parent, I think to some extent, like, we shelter our kids, right? And it made me realize after seeing this look in my son's eyes that this might be the first time in his life that he's had that responsibility. Like, whatever happens for the course of the next 30 seconds, win, lose, crash, whatever, like, it's on you. It is completely, you have agency over all of it. And I don't know that he's ever been in that position. And to see the excitement of that is pretty incredible. It makes you think like, okay, how can I create this environment for my sons more often, right? And racing is obviously a catalyst for it.
I feel like I had that look in my eyes when I moved out of the house at 18 years old, because it's never really been on me. And all of a sudden you come outside, you're all excited, and you get out there and the world hits you in the face. You're like, oh crap, I want to go back in. Let me in. But,
yeah, no, and it's and you talked a little bit about like the learning to lose. So it's a funny story, and I know I've shared this like with an elite, so you may have heard it at some point, Brian. But so my son, like I said, his start in racing has been our local tracks. We don't get enough junior dragsters to separate by age groups, so he's racing against older kids that obviously have more experience and are able to go faster. And then by virtue of that, and by virtue of me not really having any idea what I'm doing, as a tuner, like they have better cars, right? So he doesn't have much of a chance coming in, especially the first handful of times that we went out. So we went to our local track probably 4 or 5 times and didn't win around, right? And he was fine with it, like having fun, realizing that he's learning, like, advancing, like this is all cool, no problem. And so we went to Bowling Green one Sunday. Our home track is an independent track. So we went to Bowling Green mainly just to get his license. And he completed his licensing runs, and they let him race that day. So he loses first round against an older kid, made a decent run. And so we buy him back. Well, second round, he's running like an 11-year-old in an 890 car. And Gary, my son, leaves the starting line. And I'm like, oh, that was good, right? And I kind of lean over around the blocker and watch the other side of the tree. I'm like, we have like a 10th on the starting line. We might win. And his win light comes on. I'm like, wow. And then he's 008 on the tree, so he gets the bye run the next round. And so it's the first win light, right? But it was amazing then how it like immediately dawned on him how much cooler it is to win than it is to lose, right? And all of a sudden, the burden of expectation went like through the roof, right? Because now he ends up, he turned it red the next round, which was the semifinal. And he was racing an older kid who I think was leading the points. They're a really good racer. But when that kid left the starting line, the carburetor literally fell off the car quick. And so Gary's red. And I get to him at the other end, and he's staring at his time slip, and he's studying it. And he's like, Daddy, how did I lose? I'm like, well, you red lighted. And he's pointing to the other side of the time slip. And he's like, but he didn't even like go. He just got a 60 foot in the other lane. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter after you go red. And he's kind of putting it together. And he's like, so all I had to do was be green because he didn't break out. And I'm like, yeah, and it's waterworks. You know what I mean? I'm like, what happened? We went 6 weeks without winning a round. This was a good day. And he's, no, like I could have been in the final. Yeah, you could have.
I told you that all the time. Sorry.
So
oh my God. But back to your point there about your first run down the track. Mine was in a stick shift super stocker. Time run, the Saturday morning time run at a divisional was my first trip down the track in that car. I didn't even run the index, and I had to go into first round. I'm like learning how to stage, shift, and cut a light. So.
Yeah. Bobby, maybe your dad's theory was there's so much going on in this car, he has no way of getting nervous.
To be honest, I wasn't. I was like, I don't know. I stalled on the starting line first round. I shoved the throttle to the floor, started it back up. I was still somewhat rolling. I was already in pre-stage. As I did all that, I was staged, and I had to, shove it to the floor and launch. I was like 50 on the tree, believe it or not. But I was still couple hundredths over the index, so I still I lost. But it was the most fun I ever had in my life, and then I was hooked ever. After that, as far as driving a stick car, like wow,
So where did you go from juniors then? What was your next step?
Yeah.
So we did that for a couple of years, and this sounds kind of bad to say now, but I got a little bit burnt out on it, and I don't know, part of it might have been the parents aspect of it, not my parents, but just the kind of the little league aspect of junior dragster racing, which is probably still prevalent to some extent to this day, but it wasn't fun. But it was, honestly, I think at that age, like I had a fair amount of success early on. And keep in mind, like I was basically racing with all the same kids. Like we grew up together at the racetrack. We played football together in the field. We raced Lego cars, and then we all got into junior dragsters. And for whatever reason, like I just kind of took to it more quickly than the majority of them, and I won probably more than my fair share. And it got to the point that it was like that was impeding on my friendships. You know what I mean? Like I was no longer like the fun kid to hang out with. Like I was the guy that was maybe winning a little bit too much. And at 12 and 13 years old, I don't think I processed that very well, or figured out how to differentiate between the two. And so the easy fix to me was like, well, I just won't race, right? And it came at a time when my father was wanting to build a new race car for himself, and we needed the money to do it. So we ended up selling. He had a Vega at the time. We sold his Vega. We sold my junior dragster and built this altered. And I actually went to working at the racetrack, pumping fuel on race nights at their little gas station there at Texas Raceway. And I was mowing the pits in the summer times and things like that. I did that for about a year and a half and saved up some money and actually bought my first race car, which was not much. It was a 73 Nova basically a hot street car that poo brown, like ugly, just god awful, right? And I think it went high eights in the eighth mile, but bought it from a local racer, made me a pretty good deal on it. And so I had this at 14 years old, and my dad raced it a little bit while I was working at the track. I had a couple of friends, Wendell Dunaway, Daryl knows some guys there that were a big part of my upbringing locally that drove that car. And then I started somehow or another, kind of got the idea and started pressuring my dad. I'm like, there's an outlaw track. I couldn't race at Kennedale, right? It was an NHRA sanction. They had rules, like you had to legit be 16, have a driver's license. And so somehow I got it in my head that one of the outlaw tracks down the road, like they might let me race. So I kept pressuring my dad. So finally he took me down there to just make some runs on like a test and tune day. And I was 14 and a half maybe. And I've got pictures from that day. Like it's a wonder that they let me go down the track, because I looked every bit of 11, right? But there was no issue. I went down the track and obviously acquitted myself to the point like nobody thought I was going to hit anything. I didn't throw up any red flags. So we leave there and I'm like, Dad, you got to take me back. Like, I think they'd let me race, because they had a, Saturday night bracket program. So that turned into going down there once a month, probably for the rest of that year. And say it's similar to you, like the first race that we went to, I'm in, high on the horse, like, this stuff's easy, like I'm gonna show everybody how to do it. And I'm running, I had a old like 3-digit Nazir delay box that I got at a swap meet. So I'm running in, the top bulb class and the foot brake class. And I get smacked around pretty early in both. And we're loading up that first night, and they announced that they're going to do like a consolation race, and whatever, there might have been 12 people sign up. Well, I end up signing up for that and I win. So I won the first night in my junior, and kind of won the first night in a big car. So that was cool. And then pressured Dad. We ended up going down there about once a month. And then when I turned, like the day I turned 15, in Texas, at least, I think this is still a thing, you could apply for a hardship driver's license. Basically, like both parents worked, I need to drive myself to school type of thing. And it had provisions. You had to drive like during daylight hours, whatever. But I had a legal driver's license at 15, and that allowed me. The reason I got it the day of my birthday was not to drive to school, it was to race. So that allowed me to start racing at my home track.
We didn't have that in Pennsylvania. That would have been wonderful. I don't think my parents would have went for it though, even if they were both working.
There's so many things from my youth that I look back and I'm like, thank God my parents had a sense of humor. Like,
I got caught taking the car out of the garage one time. When they came home, they knew something wasn't right. The car, when it's hot, it's like cooling off. And they came home. He could always tell something. I put that car in the exact same spot I found it in. Nope. Caught.
Yeah, exactly. No, this is like, I just hope that my kids get more of my wife's like genetics, mindset, whatever, when I look back. So I'll take up a little bit of time here, but this is one of my favorite stories, and I don't know how on earth I ever got away with it. But that later that year, like I said, my dad's taken me to, it was Cedar Creek Dragway. It was this little outlaw track that we would go to once a month, and it's like the last weekend of the year, and we're going to go down there. And my dad calls home at noon on Saturday. He's at work, and he's like, hey, I got tied up at work, like I'm gonna have to be here. I can't go to Cedar Creek. So I'm devastated, right? Well, on the weekends that we were home, when he had to work late, we only lived like 3 miles from my home track at Texas Raceway. So my mother would take me out to the track, and one of my buddies would drop off their car in the pits, drive over to home, load up my car, and unload it so that they could race it. So when he tells me we can't go to Cedar Creek, I'm like, all right, so just take me out to Kennedale. I tell my mom, like, just drop me off at the track, And so she does, and I get my buddy Daryl, and I'm like, hey, we gotta go back, get the Nova. Like, all right, cool. We get back, and I was like, I'm gonna drive it today. He's like, how are you gonna pull that off? Like, I don't know, but I was gonna race today. By God, I'm gonna race today. And he's like, well, you grew up here. Like, everybody knows you, and everybody knows that you're nowhere near old enough to drive. Like, you don't have a driver. Like, it's not going to work. Like, it'll work. It'll be fine, right? So I pull into the staging lane for the last time trial session. I'm like 6 cars back. I got my helmet on. Like, nobody's going to know it's me, right? Well, somehow or another, I get through the time trial and like first round in both classes and win, in pro and no electronics. And then I hear an announcement, I get called to the tower. I'm like, oh man, that's not good, right? So I walk up there, and Larry Croft, bless his heart, he was a track manager for years and years and years. And he's like, as soon as I walk up the steps of the tower, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean? Are you driving that car? Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I am. And he just like, I can't believe you put me in this position. I'm like, what do you mean? Maybe it was even after like 2 rounds, because I remember Larry telling me, he's like, what do you mean? What do I mean? You aren't old enough to drive this car. You don't have a driver's license. And you've done beat 4 of my customers. What do I do with them? Like, if I'm supposed to kick you out, what do I do with them? I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. I don't know, Larry. And he just kind of takes a deep breath, and he's kind of fuming, and he's like, listen, you get back down there. You finish this race. Don't you hit anything. Don't do anything stupid. And don't ever come back here till you got a driver's license. And he let me finish the race. I lost in like the semifinals of one class. So anyway, it gets better. So like maybe that round, the starter, it sounded awful in Old Nova. So I go to start at one round, and it kicks the Bendix off and like hits the fence beside me in staging lanes. And my buddy Daryl is standing there, and I look up at him. I go, what was that? He goes, that was a start. He says, whatever you do, don't shut it off. Okay, like ever? Until you lose, we're not shutting it off. And keep in mind, it was basically a street car. It wasn't that big a deal. But we went like 3 hours then pouring water in one end, fuel in the other, never shut the thing off, get to like the semifinals. So anyway, then I get home that night, and I'm like, my dad asked, like, how'd Daryl do? I'm like, oh, Daryl did great. You know, he lost in the semis in one class and quarterfinals in the other. It was an awesome night. Cool. I said, but hey, when we go to get the car tomorrow, we had 2 open trailers at the time, like one single axle deal that I normally use, and then one, you know, like the nice open trailer that actually had a winch and stuff on it. I'm like, hey, we're gonna have to take the big trailer because the starter's broke. Like, we're gonna have to winch it up on the trailer. Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. So we go to the track the next morning, and you know, nobody's there. It's Sunday morning. Well, the owner of the track, who was not like super involved, right? Older guy, he'd been a world champion in Superstock years prior. It was just, you know, basically the man behind the track didn't have much to do with it, and was kind of out in left field for the most part, right? But he and my dad were really close. He comes walking down the hill from where he lived, and I'm like, I'm not even worried about Hutch, right? Like comes up to my dad, and he's like, Bo, your boy did good last night. He's like, yeah, he said Daryl did a good job, right? And I don't know how I've justified it in my mind that my father's not going to find out about this, but I had, right? And he's like, Daryl, hell, your boy got in that car, done good. And I could tell the look on my face as my father put it together, like he wanted to be mad at me, but there was a part of him that was proud of me. You know what I mean? So I was watching him kind of work through that in real time. Yeah, I gave that man a lot of gray hairs prematurely.
Oh man, that's a great story right there.
It was fun.
You know, they say the scary thing is our kids double everything we have, right? Like however you are, your kids will be that times 2.
That's what I keep thinking. Like, this is all going to come back around. Yeah.
See, I was my parents said I wasn't responsible enough, so I didn't get to my driver's license till I was 16. But I could tell you, I had a lot of miles on before then. I would just always make sure I parked the odometer so the last 2 numbers were always the same. And I always put the exact amount of gas in. And I shouldn't tell this story on where it's recorded, but I will because I'm in this for a while. There was a girl who I thought was pretty cute that was at the lake, which was 15 miles from my house. And my buddy was already there, and he's like, oh, man, you got to come. So the plan was to go there. Well, I took the car, which was a convertible. You know, the old like Chrysler 300, ugly convertibles like my parents thought was the coolest thing ever. So we go down there, and I'm hanging out, and my buddy backs into the side of it and like hits the fender, like dents the fender. I'm like, oh, crap. So I do the normal, drive around until the odometer is about right. As I'm pulling in, it's like a little podunk farm with like the wooden garage with the slider doors. And right before I come in the door, I just go wham. I smoked the pit. I ran into the side of the garage, so I got the red paint off the fender and parked it in the garage. And my parents come home. They're like, I said, I did something bad. And they're like, what's that? I said, well, I backed the car out so I could sweep the garage, and I was pulling in and a cat ran in front of me and I hit the garage. Until now, they won't listen to this anyways, but nobody has ever knew that that's how the car got broken. So now I come home one day and I pull in the garage. I told my wife, I'm like, something's hot. She goes, I smell nothing. I said, I guarantee you the kid was doing something in here, and he can't ride his dirt bike if we're not home. Sure enough, I backed my pickup out, and you could see he was in doing donuts in the garage, and I could literally just smell the heat. I'm like, my kids are not going to get away with anything, because I was the master of trying to avoid responsibility of it when it comes to that. But I think you're in trouble, Luke.
Yeah, I'm coming to the same realization.
You guys, not me. I was perfect. So let's get into some racing strategy here. Luke, we all know that you are the founder of thisisbracketracing.com and former world champion a couple times. You've won $1 bazillion racing. You're probably the only racer that has like a net profit, which is pretty cool. I would say you've been doing this. I was at ACO one day and you were giving actual on-track lessons. It was probably like 10 years ago. So you've been doing this for a long time, training people. How did it really turn into this website, and how did you like grow it? How did it start?
Yeah, no, that's a funny story too, Bobby, because we're talking go back to maybe 2004, 2005, so 15 plus years ago. I had a buddy that I had raced with a lot growing up. His name's Blake Allen. He's from the Tulsa, Oklahoma area. And he's telling me, he's like, hey man, have you ever thought about like putting on a school? I'm like, dude, I'm at that point, I'm 25 years old, like had some success, but who wants to hear me tell them how to drive their race car? You know, especially somebody that's older, that's probably been down the track more than I have. Like, yeah, I just kind of put it off. And he kept on, you know, hey, you need to do this. Like, I think this could work. Nah. Finally, after about 4 of these conversations, Blake calls me one day and he's like, listen, I've got the class put together. I got 12 people that have paid. All you got to do is come teach. I'm like, oh, okay. So it was at Mocan Dragway, probably 2004, 2005. And I was really nervous about it, just for all the reasons that I just mentioned. I'm like, man, I'm going to run into people that aren't going to be receptive to what I've got to say. Like, everybody's got their own way of doing things. Who am I to tell them that my way's better, or, you know, how to do it? And that 2 days literally made a 180 in my outlook, because the racers involved, a lot of them are elite members today. I keep in touch with several of them. Like, racers involved are so receptive, and it makes sense. Like, if you're going to invest your time and your money into something like that, you're going to be receptive, right? Like, you genuinely want to hear an opinion and want to grow. And that was such a special 2 days of watching these guys and gals implement some of the things that we talked about, genuinely, really, truly improve on the racetrack, and you could see it visually. And then to see how it kind of opened doors for them, it made me look at the thing completely differently. So that became a handful more live schools, and then became the challenge of, okay, like, how do we scale this? And that was the original thisisbracketracing.com. And then years later, into the elite community, which has grown into something that I never would have imagined. Like, we've tapped into a market that I didn't honestly know existed. But the cool thing about it is that we're still, and for so many years now, have made, I don't want to overstate it, you know, we're not solving the problems of the world, but we're building confidence and skill set among racers in something that we all enjoy, and to some extent, you know, take identity from. Like, and I do think that there's something to be said, if you're going to take it a little bit broader existentially, and a rising tide raises all boats, whatever that saying is, right? Like, you get a little bit better at something that you care about, like racing. And I think that almost inevitably that confidence flows into other areas of life, like, and can be applied in so many different ways. And that's the really cool part about it. So,
well, the one thing I noticed, so this is basically my 3rd season of being around it. You know, there's so many basics. Like, when you look at just the fundamentals of, you know, the lights and staging, and once you get through that, most people coming into this have been doing it and understand all that. I mean, to me, there's a huge mental aspect. Like, you know, I think it's funny when some people are like, well, I just holders, like, and I never understood why would somebody would want to hold, or I don't, you know, I just, all the fundamental basics, but, you know, there's such a mental game that goes into it too. I mean, it's interesting. What do you think, or what would you say is the key fundamental piece if you want to win more? I mean, where do you think somebody should start if they're kind of struggling?
Yeah, I think to your point, I mean, there's stages to this, because I want to say, just like you said, the differentiator is confidence. And I think at a certain point, it 100% is. Now, if you're Bobby, like the first time that you sit in the stick shift car and your first run is the time trial of the divisional, and you have really no idea completely what you're getting into, like you could have all the confidence in the world. It's probably not going to help much. Right? You have zero experience, and there's going to have to be there's a learning curve there, right? So that confidence in that instance is probably unfounded. But when we get to a point where we've got a basic understanding of the game, and we've developed, the general skill set of what it takes to win, or what it takes to even compete, I think the difference 100% between the also rans and the racers that you see winning consistently is completely between the ears. And at the level that you guys are racing and that I'm used to seeing, whether it's the big dollar bracket racing or the Lucas Oil Series within the NHRA ranks, I don't see a lot of racers that don't have the knowledge, that don't have the skill set. I see a lot of racers that lack the confidence. I think 100% that's the differentiating factor.
It's kind of funny that I remember the first couple times down the car, I mean, I felt like I was in a rocket ship and trying to do the burnout and how to stage and all right, how many yellows before it goes green. I mean, there's all the basics. But it seems like once you get the routine, like to me, like if you're just starting and you're struggling, like get a routine and just kind of do it the same every time.
There's so much, because you think about confidence and go like, okay, like in theory, I get it, right? Like we should be more confident, but how do you get there short of having success, right? Because we can all agree like winning breeds winning. But if confidence was solely dependent on success, then no one would ever win for the first time, right? There are ways to build up that comfort level, that confidence, without necessarily having direct success. And to your point, Brian, like I think the simplest or most common way to do that is to really drill into regimenting a relatively rigid routine in the race car. And I mean, we think about routine from the water box to the stage beams, and that's probably the most important part. I think it even goes back to like, getting in the car and suiting up and strapping in, just because there is something to going through the same repetition in the same order, time after time after time, and allowing it to spark or create some of the same thoughts and the same mental procedure, that ultimately it becomes like, hey, whatever the situation is, whatever the stakes are, whether it's a Wednesday night test and tune, or whether it's the third round at the U.S. Nationals, like there is some comfort to realizing, maybe subconsciously, that hey, what I'm doing is the same thing that I've done 100 times, 1,000 times, whatever the case may be. And I think the more that we regiment that process, the easier it is to find comfort in it.
It's almost like you generate muscle memory by doing the routine, and then it's just a matter of stress inoculation. Like it always works when it does, but that, just the more, to me, it seems like the better you get the muscle memory and the more it's just instinctual, or, you're just flowing. If something happens and all of a sudden then you just have to learn through the stress inoculation of it is all right. Just, step 1, step 2, step 3, nothing else matters.
Yeah, 100%. Like the best golfers in the world say, and I draw a lot of parallels between golf and what we do, just individual sport, and so mind heavy, and it's ultimately a lot of repetition. Like the best golfer in the world can tell you all of the technical aspects of how to hit a draw or how to hit a fade, but they're not thinking about that as they swing, right? They burn that into their subconscious through practice. And ultimately, when they address the ball, like I think that the most successful golfers would say, like, I'm in the zone, or however you want to say it, but ultimately you're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're letting that muscle memory take over. And that is essentially the same thing that we're trying to establish on the racetrack with routine is like, yeah, we want to learn and gain all of the knowledge that we possibly can to implement on the racetrack, but to do so in a way that we can actually implement it kind of means at some point you just have to trust your instincts that you've trained, right? And basically turn the brain off, the conscious brain off, to where you're not necessarily thinking through it step by step in the moment.
What do you find?
Luke, when students come to you, or when you get that first email, we'll say, or text message or whatever it may be, what's the most commonly asked question that they present to you? Like, Luke, I need some help. Can you help me with blah blah blah? Like, what's the most common one?
I would say that the most common, and also, to be completely frank, probably the most difficult to teach and the most difficult to learn, is struggles at the finish line. And I think most of us would agree it's somewhat easier as the faster car. So if you had to really drill it down, it's doing a good job consistently at the finish line on purpose, specifically as the slower car. And there are a lot of tools that we can share to help breed that. And I feel like any successful endeavor, really, and specific to racing, it ultimately comes down to two facets. You've got understanding and execution. And individually, neither one of them is worth much, right? Like if you do what in your mind is a great job, but you don't really understand what you're doing or why, then it's probably not going to work out. If you know exactly what to do, but can't seem to do it, then that's not going to be beneficial either. So it's a matter of merging the two together. And specific to the finish line, the actual execution element of it, like I'm not going to claim to be able to help a whole lot. Like ultimately, that's going to come from repetition, from experience, from seat time. But I do think that if you really have a full understanding of what's supposed to happen, why it's supposed to happen, and when it's supposed to happen, that you can speed up that learning process pretty tremendously.
Are you a mirror guy or look over the shoulder?
I am a look over the shoulder. I've had spirited conversations with Bud McNasby on this, because he's a mirror guy, and like a really good mirror guy. I think I won't claim that there is a better or worse way to do it. I learned driving slower cars, and I learned, I was really fortunate to grow up where I did, when I did, just being surrounded by Scotty and Edmund Richardson, Tommy Phillips, the Heffler brothers. There's so many great racers that basically called my home track home. And I remember at a young age, like watching Scotty, I don't know if he had seatbelts on, just spun around looking out the back glass of his car. So that was what I tried to emulate when I started racing myself. And I've always been more comfortable if I can get spun around and actually put eyeballs on my opponent's car and pick up that rate of closure. So yeah, I think mirrors are a great thing if you like implemented it from day one. I just didn't. So I'm far more comfortable actually spinning around and locating eye contact.
The other thing too, I want to tell our listeners that are on live right now is if you do have a question for Luke, go free and put it on the comments. Let's try to stay out of like tune-up specifics, just because we're talking more broad, general, maybe strategy or mental side of things. But feel free to go ahead and post those, and we'll try to get you an answer too. So Luke, what do you think? Like, what is your best advice, I guess, for what's your game day or pregame ritual look like? Like, how do you go into the race? Like, I think I was talking to somebody about this the other day. You look at a lot of people look at the weekend as, we're going to go camp and hang out with the guys. And, you can just tell there's some people that are really on point. They got their stuff together. What separates them from the ones that seem like they're kind of lost? Like, what does your regiment look like? How do you get in the mindset of winning?
Yeah, I mean, you could go a lot of different directions with that. I think the first thing that most racers would point to, but we can all be guilty of not being great at it from time to time, is preparation before the fact. I guess mentally and physically as well, but specific to just having things kind of high and tight, race car wise, equipment wise, trailer rig wise. Like I've noticed that the older I get, Brian, like the more routine dependent I become. I guess I feel like it's natural as we get older, like there's just more going on in life. So being able to kind of put that in place and manage it all, or be what's the word that I'm looking for? Productive throughout the day. Like for me, it has to be pretty regimented. So what I've noticed, and this is probably not a good trait, but the older I get, like the less adept I am at adapting on the fly. Like when things don't go correctly, I tend to get a little bit spun out, and at times can be difficult to get back. So the preparation process of eliminating as many of those silly problems as I can before we get to the racetrack is key to me. From a physical standpoint, like I try to take pretty good care of myself, and this wasn't a thing for me 10 years ago. I think it becomes more important with all of us when we're older, like getting enough sleep, staying hydrated, eating relatively well at the racetrack. I think that all plays into it, specifically at your marathon type events, you know, whether it's multi-day races or some of the big dollar bracket races are really rough because, I mean, you could race till all hours of the night and come back and do it again the next day. And I feel like in order to perform anywhere near my capability in that, like there is a multi-day ramp up of kind of building up the sleep bank, you know what I mean, in order to be able to execute in that situation. Mentally, like I just try to keep a really positive outlook. I try to be self-aware when I'm slipping out of that and take a step back and think about why and why I'm here. And for me at this point in my racing career, it hasn't always been like this for me. Like I've been very tunnel vision for much of my career, but now I'm at a really nice stage in life and racing where it's more about family, like pretty basically with very few exceptions. Everywhere we go, my wife races. When there's juniors, my son races. The whole family is together with very few exceptions everywhere that I go. And that has made racing a lot more fun. And it helps to put things into perspective when things don't go well or you don't have success. And I don't feel like my mood or my identity is near as tied to my results as it used to be. And there's a freedom in that I think really helps. And then, I mean, to take your question in a bunch of different facets, like I derive a lot of confidence from, and we could break confidence down in so many different ways. The best way that I could explain it in my own racing and as an instructor, so to speak, is I feel like we should work to take confidence from two different things. Like one being kind of something that we can hang our hat on, that's there day after day, race after race, week after week. And for me, I would say that's typically, I try to make that preparation, right? I allow that level of preparation to build confidence. And then also, I feel like in each individual round of competition, I like to find something, and it may be completely in my own mind, but some reason that I feel like I should be successful in this round. Like maybe there's a big weather swing and I feel like I have a better handle on it than the average opponent, or the track seems iffy, but I think my car will go down it better than the average opponent, or I've been great on the tree, I'm going to continue that. I'm the faster car, that gives me an edge at the finish line, whatever. Like there's something in each round where I can convince myself that it is a slight advantage, and I will harp on that thing mentally and be like, that's why I'm going to win this round, whether that actually proves to be true or not. So finding a way to really intentionally and purposefully build up some of that confidence in those two areas for each round of competition is key for me.
So I like that strategy there, kind of convincing yourself that, you know what, I have an advantage over my opponent. That
right.
So
this is something that I do well or can do well in this particular situation or whatever. Yeah.
So back to your regiment, Bobby and I always have this because we're polar opposites. What is the required amount of times to check your air pressure before staging to still win the race? Because I check them once and we're good, but Bobby checks them 100 times. So maybe your benefit, Bobby, could be I check my air pressure more than anyone else at the track combined. I can beat him.
I will not claim to not have my my subtle quirks and things that I do, but that air pressure is not one of them. That's I'm probably a one-time a run type of guy unless we're in the staging lanes for a long period of time. But I've got other things that I do, like part of my actual on-track routine, and it's so funny. I don't know if you guys have ever messed with like putting a GoPro in the car or watching, live feed. There's things I feel like what I do specifically on the starting line is super intentional, right? Like I kind of have that rigid routine, and it's almost like a mental checklist every round. But one of the last things that I do, pretty much regardless of the car that I stage, I go through like a verbal cadence before I pre-stage, and the last one I tell myself to have fun, and I kind of like pull myself up, right? Like just kind of resituate. So in my Corvette or in a dragster, I'm kind of grabbing the roll cage bars, and in my Vega, it's the down bar in the cage. Just kind of grab something and resituate. And in my mind, like I go through that process and I do that. And then when I see myself on camera in a GoPro, like I do that. And then I'll inch forward like 6 inches toward pre-stage, and I'll do it again. And then I'll inch forward another 2 inches. And I do it like 4 times before I pre-stage. There's subtle quirks that we all have that are, maybe some of it's nerves, some of it's, being a little bit compulsive, obsessive, like whatever. But I think we've all got them.
Look, I did hear you in a podcast one time say you tilt your head down and look up, and it was totally like you were like, you don't have to blink if you do that. And I was like, yeah, right, that's not possible. And I sat there and I was like, wow, he's right. So that was pretty cool. Like,
yeah, I can't even take credit for that, Bobby. I did one of those live schools that we talked about earlier years ago. I did a couple of them actually with Troy Williams Jr., a really successful, maybe the best like big dollar bracket racer of all time. You could make that argument. But we did a couple of schools together, and he shared that, and he's like, look, like the human blink is 600ths of a second or whatever. You see various studies on that. But the point is, like, you don't want to blink while the tree's coming down. That's not conducive to success, right? And so he had us do this exercise in the middle of class. He's like, just tilt your head down to say, look at your desk in front of you, and without moving your head, raise your eyes up. So you're kind of looking through your eyelids to look at me, and then try to blink. And it's almost painful. Like it's hard to do. So I incorporated that on the starting line, namely not to blink. And maybe there's nothing to it specifically. Maybe it's just the result of having made that part of my routine for so long. But I feel like for me, that helps also catalyze like a level of concentration. Like it's go time in my mind, when I'm kind of looking up through my eyelids. And I feel like it kind of helps me get to that next level, that we all want to get to, of acute concentration once both cars are staged.
I suppose it's just that you're doing it with purpose. Like your mind mentally, when you do that, it's like activating the switch. All right, I'm going to purposefully do this every time. It just becomes muscle memory.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. I think you're right. I think the intention element of it is definitely a part of it.
Yeah.
So we did have one question from Tim Barrett. I've heard the term spot and drop. What is this, and how do racers do it?
Okay, so this is some of the verbiage that we use within This Is Bracket Racing. We basically break down your core finish line strategies into one of 3. The first being the dialer, that I think anyone has raced in a handicap instance is comfortable with. And that's basically like, I'm going to win because I'm going to have a good light, and I'm going to match my dial in. Like I'm going to dial my car what I think it'll run. And unless I'm way ahead, I'm going to hold it on the floor and hope that it matches that dial in. And then you've got the polar opposite of that, which is the driver. That's the term that we use, as the driver. And that's basically saying like, look, I'm going to win this race because I'm going to have a good light, and I'm going to cross the finish line ahead of my opponent by a small amount, right? Normally that means I'm going to dial something slower than what I think I could run, sandbag, however you want to connotate that. The spot drop strategy is a little bit of a mixture of the two, meaning that typically to be successful as a spot dropper, we need to have a consistent car, right? We need to have a car that we could win with as a dialer. But let's say that car, we think that we're capable of running 1050. Rather than dialing 1050 and holding it on the floor, we're going to dial up a predetermined amount of ET. Say it's 200s, 300s, 400s, whatever the case may be, with the sole intention, not necessarily of outdriving our opponent at the finish line, but the sole intention of lifting off the throttle and or tapping the brakes at a predetermined point on the racetrack in an effort to kill those 2, 3, 400ths of a second, whatever the case may be. And so the idea being that we're still going to match the dial in, but we're going to do it as a moving target. And you say, okay, well, what's the advantage to that? The advantage to that is basically to disguise a poor reaction time. Okay, let's say in that same example, let's say that we're racing an opponent dialed 10 flat, and whether that opponent realizes it or not, they're capable of running 999, right? They can go under the dial in. Well, let's say that that opponent is 10 on the tree and we're 40. And if we're dialed 1050, what we think we can run, our car can make a perfect run, and we're going to be like 40 thousandths package, right? We're 40 on the tree and dead on zero. Well, that opponent that is 10 and going 100th under, he had a 300ths advantage on the starting line, plus he's outrunning us 100th in reference to our dial-in. So as we approach the finish line, he or she should be 400ths ahead. And given that spot, that half-second spot, the average race in the other lane is going to realize, like, hey, I'm going to get there first. I have enough room to step off the throttle, touch the brakes. And odds are they're going to kill that 100th of a second that they were breaking out to not break out and ultimately win. If you take that same scenario, but rather than being dialed 1050, let's say that we're dialed 1053. Well, now the math all changes. We're still 40. They're still 10. So they have 300ths of a second advantage on the starting line. But now as we approach the finish line, they're going 100th of a second under. We're going 300ths of a second under. So what that suddenly does now is it takes that 300ths advantage that they had on the starting line and makes it just 100th of a second. So now as we approach finish line, the race is close. And the majority of opponents in the other lane are going to say, oh, I think I'm going to get by, but it's too close to do anything about it. Well, about the time that they make that decision, in theory, we hit our spot, lift off the throttle or tap the brakes, kill the 300ths. We end up making the exact same run that we would have made, right? We're 40 and dead on. But we did it in a way that is much more likely to induce a mistake in the other lane. And it's in this situation, I think the odds of that opponent running 100th or 1,000th of a second under the dial-in go way up and increase our chances of win. That's the spot drop theory in its simplest form, and that's really the reason that it can be so successful.
Well, like anything, it just takes practice and knowing your spot and knowing your car and
it
creating.
does, but that particular strategy is simpler, I think, to implement than about anything else we can do, because really it's something that we can implement and practice on a time trial, on a test day. Like it really doesn't have anything to do with the track position of the car in the other lane. It's simply figuring out how far from the finish line we can respond with some type of foot action. And what I typically tell people that are new to it is, like, that are skittish about, hitting the brakes or knowing exactly where they are on the racetrack, like, take the same foot action that you currently use at the finish line. Like, you cross the finish line and eventually you have to slow down to make the turnoff, right? So whatever it is you do at the finish line now, it doesn't have to be any more dramatic than that. Let's just do that 60 feet earlier, 80 feet earlier, 100 feet earlier. And obviously the most common, easiest reference for that is what I would call the mile per hour cone. It's the first cone of the traps. That's 66 feet from the finish line. Like, that's a good reference point. I'm not saying like just drive to the first cone and hit the brakes, but usually our spot's going to be based off of that somehow. It's either going to be at that spot or a car length past it or a car length before it or whatever the case may be. But yeah, actually developing that and then implementing it is not as difficult as it seems, because it's not dependent on picking up track position and closing rates and identifying what your opponent's about to do. It's really just making a run in your lane and focusing on what you can do, kind of regardless of what's happening beside you.
That's good. And it will disguise bad reaction times, which is great about it, but it will not disguise an inconsistent car, I don't think. So you have to have a consistent car. You have to know what that car is going to run. And some people think, oh, if I just spot drop, it'll help my inconsistent car maybe win more rounds. And
yeah, no, not necessarily, because like, same deal. Basically, with some exception, you're kind of locked into, in that instance, like, I'm holding 3. Well, if your car picks up 3, now you're holding 6, and you don't know that. You know what I mean? So it's not. Yeah, I really think like success in the spot drop element is when we try to think about game planning, like where to pull certain clubs out of the bag. Like, the spot drop's really successful when you know what your car can run and maybe aren't quite as confident on the starting line, right? Because it can disguise that reaction time. But if the car is inconsistent, like it's a much harder strategy to execute, but usually that's when we want to lean more on the driver strategy, which is like, I'm just going to cross the finish line first by as small a margin as possible.
Right.
But
So
once you
switch.
think,
Yeah, does that happen? Like you start with one strategy, but wait, I have a football field here. Am I holding more than I thought I was? What is going on? Now I'm no longer spot dropping. Now I have to turn into what you just called the driver as the holder, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like to take, if we had a fourth kind of base strategy, what we call it is meshing those three together. We call that the monster. That's basically staging with the staging with an idea of what's going to happen, but being able to iterate based on track position and to identify that and then execute accordingly. And ultimately, to me, that comes down to, we try to break things down, from a teaching element into something more palatable, and less abstract. So if I were to break down like successfully driving the finish line into three phases, for me, it's number one, game planning, which is not as complex as it sounds. Like basically the game plan for me is saying, okay, I think I can run X on dial Y, or maybe X, right? Like maybe it's the same thing, but maybe you're dialed up from it or down from it. And then based upon that, what am I going to do in three specific situations as the race unfolds? Situation number one, I realize that I'm going to be ahead when we hit the finish line. Like how do I want to respond to that based on my strategy? This is all pre-race. Situation number two, like I can't catch them or they're going to go by me. Like I can't get to the finish line first if we both hold it wide open. And then the third, potential situation is like, it's going to be really close, right? Which happens more often than we probably want to admit, right? There's times where you just can't really tell. But to predetermine what am I going to do in each of those three scenarios based upon my strategy? That's the game planning aspect. Then you've got the decision-making element, which is obviously actually down track, determining the rate of closure and making one of those three calls. Like if we both hold it on the floor, I'm going to cross first, I'm going to cross second, or it's going to be really close. And then the third is execution, which if you do the first two well, it's not a matter of really iterating on the fly. It's simply taking the strategy that you had coming in, one of those three options, and then appropriately choosing it based upon how the race is developing, right? So in my mind, like I always say, I feel like we do better on the test when we know the answers coming in, right? So I think the game planning stage is really critical in that regard, to just, again, simplify things and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do if, so that on the racetrack, we're not necessarily thinking through every possible scenario. It's more or less of like, oh, okay, well, I said if I was going to get in there first, I was going to do it like this. And then you just try to execute that in the moment.
So a lot of that's just having.
We have a question from Jake Howard when you get a chance.
A lot of that's basically just having your plan is before you even pull up into stage, have a plan, know who you're going to race, and then kind of having the plan and then basically implementing it, right? Like you can't implement what you haven't planned for.
Yeah, having a plan, but with like specific options, because I feel like it's one thing to say like, oh, I got a plan, but anytime in my racing that, let's say for instance that, it's that really fast morning round and you're seeing double breakout after double breakout after double breakout. Well, going into a round saying like, I probably don't want to cross the finish line first, that's not a good plan, because it seems like every time that I lock into that, I run the one guy that's four above, you know what I mean? Like, and I look like a moron. So it's having like, to me, the right game plan is a specific set of options based upon what unfolds.
Well, it's like Iron Mike said, everybody has a plan until you've been punched in the face, and that's
fair.
Which kind of brings us back. There's another question. I think this is pretty important and kind of plays into that. But Jake Howard said, so say you're pre-staged and staged. Your opponent is pre-staged and taking forever. What do you do not to lose?
Lose your concentration.
Yeah, so that's a good one, because the thing, like 99% of the races that we attend today is run on auto start, right? So that protects against like the stupid long, somebody hanging out for 30 seconds or something like that. And say like at an NHR event, that auto start setting is typically 7 seconds, which doesn't sound like long, right? And in reality, it's not. And it's easy to say until you're sitting there and your opponent hasn't staged for 6.5 seconds. It seems like an eternity, right? So how I try to combat this and my take on staging in general is, again, like I try to personally be very regimented, and to the point of, I think if you took a stopwatch from say like the time that both cars pre-staged to the time that I staged, I think it's very, very similar every round. Like both cars pre-stage, I look over, reference a spot, I start, the process of bumping in. And I feel like I'm very precise in that process. So I would say more often than not, I think I stage last. Like I'm just slower about it. But at the same time, like it doesn't bother me at all. So if my opponent's not staged, like I'm still going to stage in that amount of time. And if they are going to take a long time and or kind of hang me out, whether that's intentional or not, like some people just have a long routine, and some people have a really quick routine. So and that can be that can rush us in the same way. I think the main thing to remember is that we own our time on the starting line, so there's no rush to stage first. But in that specific situation that Jake laid out, what I try to do, like I'll hearken this back, and I know this isn't necessarily applicable to probably half of your audience that are true foot braking or in a stock eliminated car, but definitely applies to the super stock guys. Is one thing that helps me is when I stage first in a trans brake application, is that I will hold the car staged with the foot brake until my opponent is staged before I'll actually go down on the button. That way it allows me to kind of take full advantage of auto start. Like from the time that I press in the button to the time that the tree starts down is going to be pretty much the same round to round. So it eliminates some of that physical tension. And it just kind of helps me to, like, that's the cue for concentration, right? Like I'm looking at the tree, obviously, but until my opponent stages, like I'm not just locked in. And I think you do the same thing in a foot brake application. Like it's a little bit harder if you stalled it up to bump in, which is like the way that I bracket race, because that inherently is going to build up some physical tension. But just from a mental focus standpoint, like I won't focus on, say, the bottom bulb until both cars have staged. Like I'm just kind of looking at the tree, like not even necessarily focused on their stage bulb. Like I'm going to see that when it comes on, and that's when I can lock in. That's probably the best way that I can describe to help break that up and make the process that we want to embark on the staging lane as consistent from round to round, regardless of the order of the staging process.
So a question I have that I think I know the answer to based off of what Justin's told me, but what are your thoughts on blocking?
Yeah, not a fan. I know that it has its place because it can eliminate so many variables, right? And obviously, I don't get to race bottom bulb stuff as much as I used to. I've actually made that a focus this winter of getting, because there was a time where I was really confident off the bottom, and I just don't do it enough now to be there. But even when I practice and really feel good on the bottom, like I think most racers would agree, like my window of variance is better on a pro tree or with a delay box than it is off the bottom, just because you're just reacting to one thing, right? There's less that can go wrong. So I see the argument in that regard. The problem, at least in my experience with blocking, is you guys may have some information to rebut this, but I have honestly yet to see anyone that repeatedly, consistently could do it at night. And I've seen it tried a lot of different ways, And so then the issue then becomes like, okay, I'm going to block all the time. I'm going to block all the time during the day. And honestly, at the majority of NHRA races, like you don't have to deal with a nighttime situation, right? But inevitably at some point we will. And then it becomes like, okay, is it dark enough to pull down the blinder? And then, what is my natural spot, so to speak, versus my blinder spot? Like, how am I going to compensate for that? It's just a whole lot of variables to think about and to try to determine. Plus, there's the inevitable like dusk or even dawn situation where you're questioning, like, am I going to get enough glare around the blinder that I should take it down? Should I leave it up? Like, it's just another thing to think about that I think could largely be eliminated. Another problem, so to speak, or something that takes a lot of discipline, I think, with a blinder is particularly as the faster car. Like it's one thing when you know that the tree's coming, as the faster car on a big spot, like 2, 3, 4 seconds, you're kind of trying to count that off in your mind, or maybe you're looking around the blinder to see the other side of the tree come down to tell you when to be ready. Because I think we all have a window of focus that is probably tighter than we'd like to admit. I mean, you can see that just if you're hitting a practice tree on like Pro Tree or Top Bulb with a delay box, like Jack with the auto start settings, like you can move it half a second. It doesn't seem like much, and you're just completely out to lunch. You know what I mean? Like the tree just comes on when you're not ready. So that inherently becomes a challenge. And I think ultimately I would stray more toward and have strayed more toward just trying to get as good as I can be at focusing on the third light, but seeing the rest come down in my peripheral, like kind of knowing that it's coming. And admittedly, in doing that, I may give away a little bit during the day, right? I may not be as consistent as a blocker. I may not be as consistent as I would blocking, but I think by and large, I'm willing to trade off that, whatever that may be, 2, 3, 5% that I might give up to be like 70% better when the sun goes down, or in those odd situations where it's so easy to make a dramatic mistake with the blinder.
So it kind of ties back earlier when you were talking about confidence. Like I started blocking just because it gave me a lot of confidence, whether it's a crutch, right? Like it's there. But boy, like you said, when the sun or when it goes down or it gets night, like it does the opposite. It rips any confidence you have because you're like, holy crap, now what? So definitely.
Now, Luke, you mentioned when you were answering the last question that Jake had about pre-stage, you kept saying I reference. So you're saying that when you're pre-staged and your opponent's pre-staged, you're looking over at your opponent and just trying to see, okay, we're dead even right now. This is what it's going to look like.
Yeah, you talk to like really proficient finish line drivers. If you took 10 of them, you get a handful of different strategies. But I think by and large, you get a lot of racers that the question is like, what are you looking at as you approach the finish line, right? And in my experience with really good finish line drivers, it's about 50-50. Like half are looking at the front end or the front wheel of their opponent's car. What I adopt, the other half adopts the strategy that I do, which I call the 90-degree rule. So I'm actually referencing directly 90 degrees across from myself, a point on my opponent's car. Maybe that's the vent window, maybe it's a contingency decal, in dragsters, maybe it's the windshield or the cage or something like that. And as we go down the racetrack, I'm simply assuming that I make the decision that I want to cross the finish line first, I'm just trying to position myself just ahead of that mark. So that's, and when I reference that is when we both pre-stage. And obviously that can be a little bit tricky if you're like, say in super gas, what I run typically, like you have to keep in mind that the pre-stage and stage beams are 1.5 inches off the ground, and the finish line beams are 6 inches off the ground. So a front end won't trip the stage beams, but will often trip the finish line beams. So you have to take that into consideration. But yeah, that's the methodology. I picked that up years and years ago, and I'm just more comfortable with it. And like I say, I don't think that the 90-degree rule per se is like a necessity by any means, because you talk to a lot of great finish line drivers that aren't comfortable with that or just don't do it that way. But that is the way that I do it personally.
Good to know. Diet. What do you eat when you're at the races? I mean, I've learned that about myself. Like, stop eating the damn cheeseburgers. Like, I try to eat fruit now. Stay awake, if you will.
My really catalyzed by my wife, but we've both been, probably to be completely fair and honest, like her more than me, but we've been on a health journey probably the last 3 or 4 years that has really changed my outlook, just in terms of self-awareness. Like I'm more conscious of what I eat, what I put into my body, and far more aware of how it impacts me in terms of mood, in terms of energy, in terms of concentration, stuff that never crossed my mind 10 years ago. So yeah, I'm really regimented in that regard. One thing that I've done, and again, like people ask, like, how should I eat? How should I drink on race day? Like, I think it's more a question of like, how should you eat? How should you drink every day? Like, I don't think that changing up your personal habits on race day is necessarily a good idea. Like, you probably want to stick with whatever your body is used to. Obviously, better habits in life are probably better for a number of reasons, but I think can also show up on the racetrack. So personally, one thing that I feel like has helped me is, it's been several years ago now, but I cut out sodas in general, and really any type of sugary drinks. Like, I don't even drink Gatorade. Like, I'm pretty much water, period, day in, day out. And then specifically at the racetrack, I feel like, yeah, A, it's easier to stay hydrated, and B, it's just consistent in terms of blood sugar, whatever. Like, and I feel that in terms of keeping a more even keel. And then as far as what I'm eating, like, I'm not going to be the proponent of, like, I'm not the world's best, particularly at the racetrack, of keeping my diet just super regimented. Like, it's difficult to do. But I'm a big fan of A, eating as healthy as I can, and B, what I try to stay away from personally is big meals in general, like whether they're super healthy or not. I feel like they kind of, to some extent, like, lug me down. If I feel really hungry and need to eat, I'll usually do it like right after a round or a run, where I'm getting the maximum amount of time prior to the next round to digest and kind of recover. But by and large, like, I'm personally a big fan of snacking pretty regularly, like eating a number of times, but never a particularly big meal. So I like granola bars, and I'll do something to get protein. Like, I'll even just roll up, cold cuts or something like that, and munch on them without the bread. I feel like the gluten in general is not, slows me down a little bit. But yeah, I try to focus on things like that. Small stacks, cashews are really good. Things like that, to try to keep energy levels up without just weighing you down.
I think
Good to know. Hear that, Brian?
Yeah, I learned the new word for fancy Lunchables is a charcuterie board. So I'm going to have to pack one of those in every trailer now.
I didn't even know how to pronounce that, so I'm glad you got that out.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I know what I've learned in the last year from being on Elite is a lot of kind of what you've talked about. It's just, it really kind of simplifies and helps. Like, when we originally started this podcast, I thought we should call it Class Racing for Dummies, because I kind of consider myself as not knowing anything. So I know it's really the Elite's been really what I owe a lot of any kind of success I've had so far to that, and breaking it down and simplifying it, making it understandable. Tell us a little bit about the Elite program and how you get involved in that.
From a broad standpoint, Brian, like, I think we all want a quick fix of some regard. Like, there's got to be one big thing that I'm missing, and rarely is that the case. Like, probably in any pursuit, but specifically in racing. And actually, we had a new member orientation call last night with an Elite, and the racer put it in a way that one of our new members put it in a way that I'd never really heard, and I loved. And he basically said, my question for him was, what are you looking to get out of this experience, as a member of This Is Bracket Racing Elite? And he thought about it for a second. He said, I'll be honest. He says, I've raced long enough and I've had enough success. Like, I'm not out looking to pick up dollar bills on the ground. I'm looking to pick up pennies, and eventually they'll add up. And I think that's an awesome way to look at probably growth in general, and specific to what we do with an Elite. It's not one big thing. It's a million little things that compound over time and help get there. And so, yeah, to your point, like, what I keep referring to as This Is Bracket Racing Elite, it's our premier membership community within thisisbracketracing.com. Within that community, members not only have access to our entire library of lessons, which is immense at this point. We've been doing this for a lot of years, so there's like 400 plus lessons. Lessons are usually either some of our OG stuff was written lessons. More, probably 80% of what we got now are video trainings that are anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes in length each. And you can imagine, if there's 400 of them, like, we touch on just about every possible subject you could imagine and take a pretty deep dive into it. So that's all there at your fingertips as a member. Now, 400 of those can be a little bit overwhelming, right? So the big catalyst within Elite is the community aspect of it. So within the community, we post a new lesson each week, obviously draw attention to that. And we've got an opportunity for members to converse, to discuss, to ask questions, both of our instructors, which is myself and five-time NHR world champion Justin Lamb, as well as each other. And it just kind of, if nothing else, it keeps racing at the forefront of mind. We have immense, deep, at times discussions on so many different aspects of our game. And then obviously there's a human interaction facet to it. At least once a week, we get together for live chats within the community. They're usually hosted by Justin and or myself and or an outside expert, or sometimes an internal expert, a member of This Is Bracket Racing Elite, in which we just talk racing, talk about what it is that, our members are struggling with or is on their mind at that moment, in an effort to, kind of communally, like this is a big ask, but we all just try to take one step forward each and every day to becoming just a little bit better, to just sharpening the sword a little bit and ultimately working toward becoming the best version of ourselves on the racetrack.
It's kind of crazy nowadays when you look at all the tools out there. Like, who would race without a weather station? Like, there's still people that do it and can be successful at it. And then, all of a sudden you look at, so I'm not a logbook guy. I got Crew Chief Pro. All the weather data goes in. I'm by myself. But, simplifying it, and how much easier does that make it dialing a car? I mean, the thing we got to realize is no matter how good you are, there's people that are working at this every single day to try to get better. And it's getting, harder and harder every day. I know probably one of the biggest things that helped me was the fact that now you get these lessons all every week, but now is the time to work on it. Like, you put your cars away, you kind of go to sleep, and you're like, hey, I want to work on reaction times. Well, like, so you're a day before you're going to the track, oh crap, I was going to work on this all winter and get better at my reaction time, and I haven't even looked at it. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind, and I think that's one of the most important things I've found is being able there and having that constant slow drip mentality,
We're all guilty of becoming creatures of habit, like, hey, this is why do I do things this way? Because I've always done things that way, right? And at one time it probably served us, right? But maybe it doesn't currently, and to your point, like there are people working on this stuff. There are technological advancements every other day seemingly. And, that method of, not keeping a logbook or not, maybe it's not even not having a weather station, but not completely understanding what you're doing with it or using it to its full potential. Like, those days are, I don't want to say gone, but there is value to that stuff. And that's part of what a community like Elite preaches, is that if nothing else, it constantly provides the newest information or a different look, right? A different mindset. And it's not like you're going to adopt everything that we throw out there. Like, I don't even adopt everything that we throw out there, right? But occasionally something is going to come up that's going to stick, that's going to help catalyze that incremental growth.
I know for myself, I was joking about the other day, but I'm like, admission fees are the same whether you do good or not. Like, they don't give you a refund if you go out first round. Oh, here's half your money back. Like, the initial investment of getting to the track, the fuel to get there, all that stuff's the same for everyone. It's like, and I know, like, for myself, I'm on a pretty tight budget starting, I'm racing stock, but it's cheaper for me to invest into my mental state and the game and strategy than it is to pick my car up 3-4 tenths. Like, that's out of the realm, but putting money into myself should help. Anytime you go, you should be more competitive.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at it through that framework, like, it seems kind of silly. Why wouldn't you want to bring the best version of yourself to the racetrack? Why wouldn't you try to be your best?
People will be like, oh, that's so expensive. Why do you do this? Why do you do that? I'm like, what do you pay a month in cable? My Dish Network one before I canceled it was $160 a month, and all it did was eat your time in life. Like,
right.
We look at what we spend on things, and you put it into the just different context of, you want to get better, or do you want to stay the same? And I do appreciate you having that community. I'm glad that I saw it and got involved. But it is a limited time to get in, right? Or how often do you do enrollment, or how's that process look?
Yeah, we only open enrollment to Elite 2 times a year, for 2 reasons. Number one is we're a small team and the demand is pretty immense, right? So it allows us to focus on that. And then I think probably more importantly than that is that open enrollment allows us, we do it twice a year. We do it right now as an open enrollment period, and we shut the doors again on Friday. and then we won't open enrollment again until a week in June, typically. So twice a year. And the reason being, again, small team on our end, it allows us to kind of focus on the marketing efforts for 2-3 weeks out of the year. And then the other 49, it allows us to really drill into serving our customer base, right? And so we can go all in on marketing, and then we can go all in on, okay, let's help these people that believe in this thing and that have invested in it and that want to get better.
And look, for the people that just can't do the elite program, you have the regular traditional, this is bracketracing.com, multiple articles. Like I said, my last 2 races, I'll say, didn't like the way I drove the finish line. I need help with my finish line skills. You have a lesson for finish line. Or, my lights haven't been so great the last couple of races. You have lessons on starting line. Like, so there's an a la carte kind of program as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I would almost even break it up into 3 tiers. Like, if you are a racer, odds are like you have visions of becoming a better racer. And I would argue we can help. So even if it's go on thisisbracketracing.com, whether it's looking through some of the free resources like blogs, our podcast, we put a number of things out there that I think can be helpful, right? That don't cost a thing, right? So take a gander at that and see if it piques your interest. And then if or when the circumstances allow, like, okay, like I like what I'm seeing. I'm in a position in life where I can invest in it, right? And I want to go deeper. To your point, Bobby, we've got a handful of, well, probably a dozen, what we call master courses is probably the next tier, which typically our master course is one specific element of racing. Let's say a top bulb reaction time or bottom bulb reaction time. And that master course would include 10 of our most popular lessons on that specific subject. So we've got a finish line master course, we've got a mental game master course, we've got a strategy master course, etc. And then the third tier is obviously membership in the elite community, which is unlimited access to all of that and more, plus direct access to the community and to Justin and myself.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to check that out for sure. Anybody that's out there, why not? Go on there. This is bracketracing.com. Check out the free material and pique your interest, especially your starting line abilities, because I'm on Drag Insights right now, and I just saw that your average reaction time in Super Comp is an 0.12 since 2015. So that's pretty amazing.
Sounds pretty good when you say it like that, yeah.
Or if you live under a rock and you haven't heard of the Sportsman's Drag Racing podcast with Luke and Jed, another great resource.
Yeah, man, we have a lot of fun with the podcast. We're recording our potties tonight, so that'll be fun. That's our annual award show.
Yeah, I will. That was the first podcast I ever actually listened to. I helped Craig build this place, and I was looking, and actually my buddy John McLaughlin's like, you got to listen to Luke and Jed. It's awesome. So awesome job there, knowing what actually goes into these. Like, you're killing it. You make it look so easy.
Well, I think a lot of that, like we've been doing that 5 years or so now. And to your earlier point, it's such a time commitment, and it's such a, there's so much more work behind the scenes, to what you guys do than most people realize. I can honestly say, as much as I love doing it, and as much as I love, having a voice kind of broadly, within the Sportsman drag racing community, it's an opportunity for me to talk, not necessarily about my own racing, not necessarily about teaching the game, just about what's going on in the sport, right? And shedding that spotlight on other racers. As much as I love that, I don't know that I would be 5 years into a weekly podcast if it wasn't for getting to do it with Jed. Like, that dude is so fun, and just, you can't be around him and not smile and be entertained. Like, I don't know if I could have another podcast partner where I'd be like, yeah, I'm all in. Like, let's go for year number 6. And with Jed, like, it's cool. It's an opportunity to talk to Jed once a week, and I can't pass that up.
I'm gonna have to step up my game, because that's probably what Bobby thinks. Man, I wonder if there's any other partners out here that would make this thing fun. I make Bobby miserable, so you guys can go to our website now, and there's a donate now button, and you can help support the cause.
That's the other aspect of podcasting. Like, not the most profitable endeavor in the world. If you guys figure that out, let me know.
Yeah, we will. Don't worry.
I think picking up beer cans on the side of the interstate in a dry county would be a little more A little more rewarding, but we don't necessarily do it for that aspect. It's just fun to talk about it and spread the message. And
100%.
And we've got some people that are helping, support, and I do appreciate that. And like I said, we're trying to make it easier if you guys do want to support us. Our website's live now and going, and there's a donate now button, so we're making it easy for everybody asking. I appreciate your time, Luke. I guess before we let you go, is there anybody you'd like to thank and let us know how we find you, and any sponsors or anybody you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on the list. Like from a racing standpoint, it obviously starts here at home with my family, my wife Jessica. I've been pretty open about this. It was just a couple of years ago that I was interested in other pursuits. I was kind of burnt out on racing and young family and everything like that. And I went to Jess and was like, should we just? I don't know if you want to sell anything. Do you want to just take a year or two off? And she's like, no. Why would we do that? Like we're going racing. So she really drove that more than I did at one point and kept that going. And it's cool. It's so fun on my end to be so passionate about this sport, but to be surrounded by my wife, really both of my young sons that are as, or maybe even more gung-ho about it than I am. Like that definitely makes it fun and makes it easier to justify the time and energy and commitment that we all put into this game. So definitely there. Race car wise, like we had an awesome season this season, particularly in super gas, and a lot of that goes back to my car. Like I can't say enough about Charlie Stewart race cars and the machine that he's built me in that C7 Corvette. That thing's amazing. I think as evidenced not only by the super gas world championship, but when we decided to bracket race it, which we haven't done much, we went to the Great American Guaranteed Million, and that thing went 482 like every freaking round, and it's 35 degrees outside or something crazy. Like you wouldn't think that would be the tool for the job, and it just kept doing it. Like the car's amazing. So kudos to them. And then on a business standpoint, I tend to get most of the praise for what we've built with This Is Bracket Racing and This Is Bracket Racing Elite is sort of the face of it. But there is a great team behind the scenes there that at this point, the way that thing's grown, I could not do it without. Obviously, it starts with Justin Lamb, who I talked about earlier, but we've got a team that includes Jordan Pratt, Jacob Murphy, Ashley Thompson, Amanda Campbell, and what those people who are all racers who all came to us, at first as members of This Is Bracket Racing Elite, and then ultimately joined our team. They keep this thing rolling and make it look good, and that they're a big part of what makes this beneficial to so many racers.
Well, awesome. Like I said, we appreciate your time. We know you're a busy guy and tied up now with enrollment going. So thanks for coming in, making us all a little better in the stock super stock community.
But man, I appreciate the opportunity. This has been a lot of fun. Love what you guys are doing. And like I say, I know that in this day and age, it's been like a decade since I staged in Stock Eliminator. It doesn't seem that long ago. So I feel like I'm not all that removed from it, but I'm pretty removed for it. So I appreciate you guys kind of going out on a limb, having me on here and getting to talk to your audience. And if the opportunity ever presents itself again, I'd love to jump back on.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. This is bracketracing.com. Check it out. Get signed up for the Elite program. Join Brian and learn. Bobby and Brian, thanks a lot. Again, classracingtoday.com is live now with the opportunity to help support the show. If you get value out of the show, decide what that value is and turn it into some dollars and throw it our way so we can continue to have these podcasts and get great guests like Luke on. Thanks again, Luke. Have a wonderful day. Everyone else, stay safe, and we will see you out on the next one. Have a great day. All right, we're clear.
All right.
Thanks so much.